Commissioner Roth,
Here.
Commissioner Nocita,
Here.
Commissioner Mom,
Here.
Commissioner Smith, and Mayor Neely.
Here. Do we have any future agenda items for the work session?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I would like to propose that one agenda item on our September 13th work session be a presentation on community visioning. I have been in contact with the consultant, Jason Robertson, who was the City of Beaverton's consultant in their visioning process. And he is actually willing to give a presentation for free to the commission. He's also suggested that it may be a good idea to invite some staff from another city. Beaverton, I mean, there's several cities that have done it. Just to give this community an idea of what it is and is not, so people can kind of have some clarity on what visioning is and what it can generate, what its costs are, what its benefits are. And I'd like to do that at our September work session if the commission so desires.
Do we have anything else planned?
No, but I'm really concerned about that because the staff has already started developing an RFP for that, and I haven't talked to Tony about the scope, but I'm imagining that the visioning can be very broad, and it can also be narrowly tailored to a certain project. You can have certain criteria that are in the scope and certain that aren't, and the price fluctuates, of course, depending on how much time that takes. My bigger concern, though, is I don't want to run afoul of any public contracting laws, and I want to make sure that people have equal opportunity to compete for that job. And if they are coming here soliciting the commission for the job outside of that process, then I'm not sure we're going to get the most competitive bids unless we give
When
that
I
opportunity.
spoke with Mr. Robertson, he made it clear that he is not soliciting for any job.
Is
he
he
just
gonna-
wants to, and again, he isn't going to charge us even for this presentation.
Sure, I don't
Is
think
he
anybody
gonna-
else would charge us if they were soliciting us for the job. I'm not saying he is or he isn't, but I'm just saying that sets up a scenario whereby I think, to be fair to all the bidders, we'd almost have to say everyone can come
Yeah.
and explain what they do and how they do it, and give you. It does open a window for them to provide a sales pitch outside the regular process that we would use to recruit a professional provider.
So maybe he can come after we've already done the bid process.
Yeah, or he or she, the firm, if they're interested in the work, for example, they could certainly send us a proposal.
Sure.
And we would put that into the matrix with all the others that I hope that we get. Also, once a decision is, I don't know, I just think that's fraught with some difficulties based on what I've seen in my other assignments. One thing you might do is direct their attention to me or to Tony, and we could talk to them about the scope and what they provide and so forth. I'm just concerned about not giving every bidder equal opportunity. But if the council wants to do it that way, that's your prerogative.
No, I would agree with you.
Yeah,
And maybe
I
they
guess I
can
should
present
answer.
afterwards.
Well, let's talk about that then, because what staff is doing now, because I would be curious to know what the scope is that you are exploring right now for this process.
Well, it's not on our agenda for tonight, so maybe can we discuss it at the next work session?
I think under my reports here in a few minutes, I
Okay.
can ask Mr. Conkle to respond. I'm on vacation today, technically.
Yeah,
Okay.
we were
So I'm
here.
I'm not ready for that question, I guess is what my point is, but I think Tony would be happy to give us an update.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about it then.
Okay.
Okay. We'll go on to our discussion items. Were there any other items for study session?
Not at this time.
Okay, we'll go ahead and do the discussion items. The financing for future library and utility system projects. We'll start with the library. Rinko?
Good evening, Commission. Well, we're kind of doing this together, Nancy and I are, because we're both in a similar situation of needing to investigate bond options for different but similar projects. And so what we did when we kind of put our brains together and thought about this mutual need is we went to David Wimmer, and he put us in touch with the bond counsel that the city has used successfully in the past. And so we've started consulting with these guys who will fully introduce themselves to you in just a moment, and they've started giving us some information that we wanted to share with you about bonds in general and our project specifically, and we thought it'd be great background for you to get before we started this whole money process. Nancy, anything to add to that?
Well, I guess the only thing I might add, I think I'm on, okay. Good evening, Mayor and Commission. The thing that I might add on the public works side of it, originally we were going to be embarking on the library bonds for your facility. And as previously when we were doing the public works site, we were looking at incremental construction, which would have been able for us to pay as you go. And now, with our direction to go to a complete new site, we are most likely going to be looking at building the entire facility at one time, which means we need to have a larger sum of money at the very get-go. And therefore, we thought, since we were doing the research for the library, we thought it'd be really efficient for these gentlemen to evaluate both the library's bond need and the public works bonding need. So that's probably my little background.
Okay, sounds good. So would you gentlemen care to step to the table and introduce yourselves, please?
And introduce yourselves if you would.
And those are on, I hope.
Good evening. I'm Harvey Rogers. I'm a partner at K&L Gates, and we're lawyers, and we represent governments like the city when they borrow money.
And good evening as well, Mr. Mayor and Commissioners. I'm David Taylor. I'm a Senior Vice President at Seattle Northwest, which is a financial advisory and bond underwriting firm, and we've done an extensive amount of work with the city over the years.
So our goal this evening is to give you the information you want. So we're going to start talking, and if we're not giving you the information you want, then you should throw something at David.
Okay.
And I'll observe that and change what I'm saying.
I'm younger and have quicker reflexes, that's why.
I believe you've got an outline in your packets that that Harvey and Dave put together that provides the general basis for the information that we thought would be important to provide tonight.
And we'll go over the information in the outline, so you don't need to look at it now unless you'd like to. So begin with something that's unique about Oregon City. Oregon City has a charter provision that requires all borrowings to be approved by the voters. So that means that that's not true for most local governments, so you need to keep that in mind whenever you consider a borrowing. There are three main kinds of borrowings that a government can consider. One is the general obligation bond. It's sort of the gold standard. It's the lowest cost financing, takes a special kind of voter approval, and the reason it's so low in cost is that it gives the city the power to levy an additional unlimited property tax. We'll talk more about GO bonds in a bit. The second kind of obligation is what's called a full faith and credit obligation. These things have a bunch of different names, but basically it's something that you got to pay back from any legally available funds. So if you got money and it's not constitutionally dedicated to something, you got to use it to pay these obligations. Full faith and credit obligations have favorable costs, but they have higher costs than general obligation bonds because they're somewhat less secure. And then the third option is a revenue bond. And this term can be confusing and it gets used sloppily, but I will use revenue bond in this discussion to mean something that's paid from a limited source of revenues. Like you could do a water revenue bond, that means you have to pay it from all your water revenues, but if you run out of water revenues, you don't have to pay it. So revenue bonds, as you might imagine, have a higher cost because they have the greatest limitation on how they're paid. And they're also more complex because since folks are only paid from a defined source of revenues, they want to make sure you're really going to have those revenues, and so they make you make a bunch of promises. So David is now going to talk in more detail about general obligation bonds.
Right, we're going to go through each of these kind of general categories in some detail, and please interrupt, ask questions as you see fit. If I'm going at too high an altitude and you want to come down into the weeds, please interrupt and ask. So general obligation bonds, as Harvey mentioned, are typically the lowest cost borrowing option if you just look at the interest rates that you can get in the market. And as Harvey said, that's because a general obligation bond is secured by the unlimited taxing authority of the issuer. Now, in order to get that unlimited taxing authority, even if you were somebody other than Oregon City with your charter provisions, you would have to ask the voters for approval of the GO bonds. They can be approved at any of the 4 elections normally on the state election calendar. 2 of those elections, the May and November elections, are not subject to the old double majority rules. In other words, 50% of those voting may approve the issue. The other 2 elections, the March and September elections, are still subject to the double majority provisions from the old Measure 50 that require not only 50% approval plus 1, but a majority of the electorate actually voting. General obligation bonds, and this is generally true of all borrowing, can only be used for capital construction and improvement. So in all these options, you really don't, for the most part, have an option to use debt to fund operating costs. GO bonds are secure because, again, once you have the unlimited property taxing authority, investors consider that relatively the strongest security you can offer based on whatever jurisdiction you are in. However, you can get authority to issue general obligation bonds and issue them, but pay them from any other source of revenue. You are not required to levy a property tax if you pay them from some other source of revenue that you may have available. Sometimes you see general obligation bonds that are also called double-barreled bonds, where you have the general obligation pledge to levy the property tax, but you also have some other pledge of additional sort of revenues. This used to be often done for a water or sewer bond in the old days before plain old revenue bonds, as we'll talk about, are more commonly used nowadays for those. So GOs are secure. They're the lowest cost available source of money. They are payable from whatever you can pay them from, but if you don't have other money to pay them, you must levy a property tax to pay them that's sufficient in amount to cover the debt service. So that's GOs. Any general questions about general obligation debt? It's the one kind of debt where you get additional sources of revenues to pay it. Okay. But it comes at, obviously, the highest price of the election and the electorate approving it. The next kind of debt in a little more detail that Harvey talked about was what we call full faith and credit obligations. These are actually issued under a statute called 271-390. It's a very broad statute that authorizes Oregon municipalities to borrow for all sorts of things and pay it from all sorts of other things. So it's a very flexible statute. It allows municipalities, including cities, to unconditionally promise to pay the debt So you encumber, future commissions to pay the debt over the life of the issue if you so choose to do so. Again, needs to be used for, basically capitalizable projects, although has a great amount of flexibility. No voter approval is required for other municipalities in general under Oregon statute, but of course you have your charter amendments to deal with on that. So for other Oregon municipalities, it's broadly used by every kind of municipality. It's a very common source of debt funding structure. The key to that is no additional sources of money. So anytime you get into a full faith and credit issue, you have to ask yourself, what sources of money are you using to pay it back? And obviously, if you have a kind of fully committed sources of funds, then you start asking yourself the question, what are we not going to do that we are currently doing in order to free up those monies to pay back the debt service? The third major source of borrowing authority is our revenue bonds, broadly defined, as Harvey said. Again, these are where you narrow the pledge to a specific sort of revenues. And the classic form is a water system revenue bond or a sewer system revenue bond, where the pledge is of the net revenues of that particular enterprise fund, fairly narrowly defined. But Oregon statutes are very broad in how you can use the revenue bond structure. But classically, it comes with a number of restrictions. So, for example, GO bonds have basically no restrictions except what the voters approve. They approve a par amount of bonds. You can structure the debt service any way you can, so long as it's affordable to repay from property tax sources. Full faith and credit bonds are basically very wide open sort of structure with no restrictions on the city's ability to issue additional bonds, and there's no specific pledge of revenues or other constrictures on you except you promise to pay it back, which is of course a restriction. Revenue bonds classically, since you narrow that stream of revenues even further, you have more restrictions because investors want to make sure that you're not overreaching and that you're going to be able to repay the debt. So classically, you will see things like a rate covenant that requires you to raise rates to meet certain debt service coverage goals. Classic cases, 1.25 times debt service. Obviously, with the charter restrictions, that has been a problem for the city, which has made issuing revenue bonds in the classic form difficult. There's typically a requirement to have a debt service reserve fund. You either have to cash fund that or you can borrow it under the statutes, but that's an additional restriction and also a drag, particularly in these markets where you might be borrowing at 4 or 5% and being able to invest the reserve at 0.5% or maybe even less after today. And then there are usually restrictions on when you can issue additional bonds that the same source of revenues is pledged to pay. So revenue bonds come with a lot of additional restrictions. As Harvey mentioned, the hierarchy in the marketplace typically is GO bonds get the lowest interest rates, full faith and credit slightly higher interest rates, and revenue bonds either about the same as full faith and credit or somewhat higher than full faith and credit, depending on the quality of the revenue streams. There are cases where revenue bonds actually get bond ratings from the now infamous bond rating companies that are higher than that particular issuer's GO bonds based on the strength of the revenues. But typically, that's the order of interest rate differential that you will see in those sorts of credits. Harvey is going to now turn to some of the legal restrictions, both in terms of the elections and then the city's charter restrictions, so that you're kind of well grounded in what those are.
All right. So your situation is that to do a borrowing, you need to have a vote. And you have some options in considering votes. The Oregon statutes provide 4 election days each year, and they're in March, May, September, and November, and you need to give the county clerk 61 days notice in advance. So you have to be done thinking about it at least 2 months ahead of the election, and you can only easily go 4 times a year. Cities have a special ability to hold emergency elections, but that's kind of a big deal, and you pay all of the costs of an emergency election because you're the only guys doing it, whereas there's some cost sharing when you go at one of the regular election dates if there's someone else in the county that's having an election at that time. If you were to wish to get general obligation bonding authority, then as a practical matter, you can probably only ask in May and November. Because for general obligation bonds, if you ask on another date, you have to have a majority of your registered voters cast ballots. And it's not typical that a majority of registered voters turn out for an election. So it's a low probability thing to approve it at some time other than May and November. Your charter limits, you have 2 that are interesting here. One is the general requirement that you get a vote for borrowings. Now, we've included the specific text of your charter amendment, and I understand you all memorized the entire charter before you started serving on the commission. So this is redundant for you, but it says that you cannot issue general obligation bonds or revenue bonds without a vote. Now, we just talked to you about how there's 3 different ways you can borrow, right? GO bonds, full faith and credit obligations, and revenue bonds. And now I'm telling you that your charter says you need a vote, and you should say, well, what about full faith and credit obligations? The problem is that there's an Oregon statute that defines a revenue bond as any borrowing that is not a general obligation bond. So you have a significant litigation risk, and it's not currently available to you to do the full faith and credit obligations without a vote. So you have to have a vote. The easy thing to do would be to go at one of the 4 times that are generally out there. You could do an emergency election if you liked. You also have Section 58 of the Charter, and I know you've heard a bunch about Section 58. Section 58 was adopted when the city raised water rates very substantially to allow the city to pay a borrowing the city needed to do. Some citizens were upset. They initiated Section 58, and it was designed to roll interest rates or roll utility rates back and then limit their subsequent increase to 3% a year. Rolling them back the way Section 58 said would not have allowed the city to pay the bonds, and the United States Constitution has a provision in it that says you can't adopt legislation to interfere with contracts. So the city, and I think Seattle Northwest Assisted, went to court, and a judge looked at this and said, yeah, you cannot put Section 58 into effect while these bonds are outstanding. And the judge didn't say anything else. So these bonds roll off fairly soon. And none of us is confident what will happen to your water rates. The range of possibilities is pretty dramatic. Someone could argue that, okay, now you need to do the full rollback that you were back to 1994 levels. Some people would argue that you should do the 94 rollback plus the 3%. Your actual current rates are quite different than that, and you've increased those rates by 3% a number of years since Section 58 was adopted, so people could take in-between positions. At the request of your city attorney sometime in the past, we looked at this and we confirmed what your city attorney said, that nobody can be sure what would happen, and we recommended that you ask the voters to approve a charter amendment turning Section 58 into something that is predictable. Now, the reason I'm I have two reasons for talking to you about Section 58 here. The first is you're considering doing borrowings, and so you need to have a vote. Well, the vote that approves the borrowings could also amend the charter. So you could fix Section 58 at the same time you authorize a borrowing. Or you could fix it with a separate measure or at a different election. So I wanted to make sure that we talked about Section 58 and the opportunity to amend it if you decide to seek voter approval for a borrowing. The second thing is that you're considering a borrowing for a public works building, and the public works building would serve the water system and other city functions. I understand from talking to Nancy that if the Section 58 were interpreted to require a severe rollback, the water system would not be able to pay its share of the public works debt. So that share would have to be distributed someplace else, and somebody would have to pay that who wasn't planning on it and probably didn't want to. So Section 58 is a significant thing to consider when you look at this borrowing package, both because you'll need to go to the voters and because the public works borrowing would stress your water rates. Now, there are two proposed borrowings that we've been asked to talk to you about. I'm going to talk about the public works facility, and Dave is going to talk about the library borrowing. And our goal here is to basically explain to you the preliminary recommendation that we've made and get you to ask questions and tell you about other options if you're interested in them. Our recommendation has been, in this case, that you do a full faith and credit borrowing for this, unless you are interested in asking the voters for general obligation bonding authority. Asking for general obligation bonding authority would get you the lowest cost, and as David said, you would not need to levy the property tax. But you would need to tell the voters that it's possible that you would levy the property tax, and it's never clear what voters perceive in that kind of a situation. So financially, the best thing for you would be, the lowest cost thing would be the general obligation bond, but we've assumed that that's more burden than you choose to carry. We don't think a revenue bond is particularly appropriate for this structure because there's not a single source of revenues that it really is allocable to the entire public works facility, and you have this lurking problem with Section 58 of the Charter and the inability of the water system potentially to carry its debt service load. Do you have any questions about that part?
I have a question about if we don't do, if we do nothing with the Public Works Department bond-wise, what happens to the water rate rollback? Do we still have to take that before the voters for an amendment?
So, hidebound conservative lawyers like me hate not understanding what's going to happen, right? So, I can't understand what's going to happen. Your city attorney can't understand what's going to happen if you do nothing. So that's why we recommend you put something reasonable in front of the voters to give you certainty. But you don't have to do that.
Right.
You could just kind of wait and see.
Well, at least an amendment to clean up that section would be good. Okay. But it doesn't have to go hand in hand. You don't have to do a bond.
I would like to just chime in that I think the water service is I'm not going to pick a favorite child of mine, but without clean water and without sustainable funding for our water system, I think the city faces some real grave difficulties. So we can talk much more about that at a later time.
Okay.
But I do think we need certainty, and I would recommend at this time that we continue along the path of trying to fix that section of the charter.
Yes.
I'm just saying it was sequencing. I would presume we'd try to fix the charter before we go out for any kind of bond support.
Well, you would have a choice. You might choose to both authorize the bonds and fix the charter in one swell swoop. Or you might choose not to. That's, the lawyers can work out the language either way. It would depend on how you like to approach your citizens.
I think it's easier to explain one thing to the voters than two different things to the voters.
Well, let me run this hypothetical by you. What if we tried putting both on and the fix to the Section 58 didn't pass, but the bond did pass? Would we have some difficulties in that case?
Oh, you bet. And
He said cheerfully.
So if you chose to address it in one action, you'd want to do it with a single ballot measure. So you would do something, and I'm making this up because we haven't talked in detail with your staff or you about what you'd really like to do, but you would have a something that says that you won't increase water rates beyond their current levels by more than 3% a year in the future, replacing the Section 58 rollback, and also authorizing you to do a borrowing for the Public Works facility, and probably you wouldn't need it, but saying that you can use water rates to pay the water system share of the Public Works facility.
But are you talking about two ballot questions in one election, or just one ballot question?
One ballot question.
But don't, at least in state initiatives, hasn't in the past there been a question about the single question, and couldn't that be vulnerable? I don't know how it is for local elections, but couldn't that be vulnerable to an attack that you're putting multiple questions in one question?
That's really excellent. There are two rules that I at least get confused about this. There's the single subject rule, which is actually fairly easy to deal with. It's just a matter of finding a superordinate category that embraces all the things that are going on. And then there's something called the Armada Doctrine, and that's a state constitutional issue, not relevant here. The Armada Doctrine says that you can't amend multiple unrelated provisions of the Oregon Constitution with a single initiative measure. And the Armada Doctrine surfaced relatively recently and has invalidated a number of state legislative matters. But you might, so we think you could, with careful drafting, survive a single subject challenge if you chose to do it that way. But the problem you raised if you do it separately is a real one, and it's why you may like to address the water rates issue first, because you'd feel pretty silly getting the bonding approval and not being able to use it.
Yeah.
I think the financial planning issue here is also very relevant with uncertainty, and which could be substantial uncertainty about the future level of water system revenues based on widely varying scenarios about what might happen. You would have a hard time or a more difficult time planning your internal set of resources that you would use to repay the full faith and credit type borrowing. And obviously you could do what-if scenarios. What if they're rolled back to 94 and with very little increases from those levels? You know, who's going to pick up the extra debt service allocable to the project? But having some certainty in the financial planning would obviously be beneficial if you could get a fix for that part of the charter that is causing confusion.
Right.
I mean, it's nice to go, you know, it's really, really good thing to, when you borrow money, to know how you're going to pay it back. Really good thing.
It's a good thing. So if we just fix the charter amendment, then we don't have to do a bond. Is that correct?
What a bond does is it moves future revenues into your pocket today.
Right.
Right. So you do a bond if you have a cash flow need to move those revenues into your pocket. I think Nancy was saying that your current desire to have a new public works building means that you don't have the cash to do it on as a pay-as-you-go basis.
Right.
So you'd need both.
And then my question would be, I know there's no crystal ball, but what are you feeling or seeing about bond measures that are going out before the public at this time? Are they passing? Are they not? I'm kind of afraid with the economy that we're not going to get very far with the bond.
Yeah, Dave should respond too. Property tax measures are particularly difficult. And you would need, I think, to have a pretty clear understanding and be able to communicate pretty clearly to your voters what the measure meant. So, for example, this is not true. This is intended to be a silly
Right.
example. But if the water system share of the public works building was going to require you to double your water rates, well, that's sort of a big deal, and if assuming you're able to explain to people and people listen and stuff like that would be a problem for you. It might very well be, however, that you could offer something that was attractive to them, which is a stabilization of water system rates. Depending on the analysis, you might even be able to offer a modest cutback in current rates and stability in their future increases, and couple it with this borrowing measure, and then you can say to people, this is a good deal for you. Approving this bond spreads the cost out over time, lets future residents here pay their share of it. There's a lot of nice things you can say.
Right.
And the library system has a source of funding for its debt service. You might want to...
And we could segue to that in a second.
It's still specific to public works. I guess concern is maybe similar to Commission President Maceda's concern. We're talking about the water rates, but in fact, the water rates are singled out specifically in the charter. Stormwater rates and other rates there would be used to fund the bond. And I'm having a hard time seeing how you can focus on just the water rates and suggesting how this will pay for the bond when in fact there are other sources of revenue going in to pay the bond. And it seems to me that they end up being two separate questions because you have more than one source of funding paying for the bond.
So you illustrate that you understand that part of this better than I do. I've been focused on the water rates because of some work we did with the city before. I haven't actually talked with anybody about what the impact would be of the other on rates of the other part of the utility system. And
They aren't covered by the charter. That's the point.
They're not covered by the charter. So the lawyer isn't paying attention to that because you don't have a legal restriction on it. But you're absolutely right. I joked about doubling the rates for the water system. If you're going to double the rates for some other system to pay for this thing, people are going to care. And times are hard. It's difficult. And you have a ton of experience, too, with voter approval on things. What are you seeing?
You know, on general obligation bonds, which is really the only votes you ever see on debt anymore, because most municipalities, if they're not doing a general obligation bond, they'll use the revenue bond statutes or full faith and credit authority to execute what they need to do, and they reserve the general obligation vote for things that are not self-supporting in some other way. But since that's really the only voted debt, I mean, our experience has been that actually it's interesting, in the last election, the approval rating for general obligation bonds was about the same as it had been, the approval rate, excuse me, is about the same as it had been historically. It's in about the mid 45% range for general obligation debt. Now, that's hard to predict how it would play out here, because you might be asking for not GO authority, but for full faith and credit authority. The GO bond votes, come almost without any question the certainty of additional property taxes. So people, when they approve a GO bond, they know they're approving an increase in their property tax rates. Your ability to get the voters to say yes to a full faith and credit type borrowing where the sources of payments are diverse and the impact is perhaps more muted on any one system, that may play out particularly differently. Our one anecdotal experience in doing this for 25 years is that voters tend to approve stuff that they believe in, and they tend not to approve stuff that they don't believe in. A lot of general obligation bonds are run with a good bond campaign, with polling to make sure that the issuer is hitting the right subject matter and they're not trying to get something approved that's going to cause a big issue. So it can absolutely be done, and in fact it is often done for GO bonds that are absolutely going to increase people's property taxes, which is obviously not a popular thing.
Okay.
Good time to talk at least briefly about, or not about, the library system. Again, the library system is a somewhat easier case to make as far as the borrowing side, because the library project has a source of revenues that could be used to pay the debt service, and that is the property tax revenue that comes from the county library district to the city. So again, the notion would be that the appropriate borrowing authority here would not be a revenue bond, because you don't have a classic set of system revenues that you could pledge. It wouldn't actually necessarily really be a GO bond, because again, your library service area extends beyond the boundaries of the city. Except you cannot get approval to levy property taxes outside the city's limits. So a GO bond would, you could argue, would unfairly burden the property taxpayers in the city and exclude all the people outside the city who are in the library service area that the city serves under the agreement with the county. But you wouldn't be able to levy a property tax on those people if you ever needed to. So again, it comes back to the most sensible approach, if you had to borrow to do this, would be to consider using the full faith and credit type borrowing, and then use perhaps the dedicated source of tax revenues from the county library area to pay the debt service on that structure. It's a little bit simpler analysis, a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more direct connection between where you're getting the money from and what the project is for. And outside of that, there are not really any other major factors to consider, except, of course, you'd have to evaluate whether the source of, what you're currently using those library revenues, the transferred revenues, property taxes from the county library service area to the city, and if you're going to redirect them to pay debt service, one, are they sufficient to make the payments by themselves, or would you need some other source of money? Or if you're using them for something now and they're going to be eaten up paying future debt service, what issues will that create for you on an operational basis, for example? Questions about how that sort of structure might work for the library project?
No. It's not a question for you. We had discussed in terms of source, of course, was the district funding. We're also talking about the amount that we used to pay for library services out of the city, which is about $150,000. Is that commitment still there? Okay, thank you. It was just a question for staff.
Well, we're still doing it. There's no guarantee.
Yeah, pardon me?
There's nothing. It's just a nice thing we keep doing. There's no, it could stop anytime, too.
No, I understand that, but the point is, if the district money is not enough, that kind of commitment, I mean, if we're going to build a library, we're going to build a library, and if the district money is not enough, then it's going to have to come from some other source like general. I mean, what you call the full faith and obligation, it'll have to come from a different source, and if there was a commitment on the part of this particular council to say, well, we're going to reserve as much money as we have in the past. Yeah.
There's also, a possibility that you could get, somewhat more complex and have some sort of hybrid. So you could theoretically, if you couldn't figure out sources of revenues or money to pay the full faith and credit, theoretically you could ask the voters in the city to do a GO bond. And probably because there wouldn't be enough revenue otherwise and actually levy, some sort of property tax to pay for kind of the city's share of the project, and then use other revenues or the county, property tax sources to pay for the balance of a full faith and credit transaction that funded the rest of the project. Libraries are a classic case of use of GO bonds. Almost every city or county that has funds construction of libraries uses a property tax-based financing system for them, because it's the classic case of a project that doesn't have its own, adequate source of revenues.
Can a GO bond be written in such a way that actually specifies that the amount of additional taxes that might be levied on the taxpayer would not exceed a certain percentage?
No, you can't do that.
You can include an estimate. You
Okay.
can't place a hard limit on it, but you can include an estimate, and that's commonly done.
Okay.
Right. One thing about GO bonds is you ask for a dollar amount of authority to borrow, and that's what you get. It doesn't in no way, and you ask for a number of years to pay it back. So typically on a capital project, 20, 25, 30 years for a new construction. But otherwise, you're not constrained. And of course, that's one of the credit strengths, is because your ability to levy property taxes is literally unlimited as to rate or amount, which is the phrase. So you have to levy whatever it takes to pay that debt service that year. However, no one goes into it quite flying so blind. You obviously get sophisticated estimates of what the property tax rates would be and translate that into what, for information for the voters, into what that might look like on an average, house residence in the city. One thing you can't do is get authority to levy a rate per thousand on a bond issue. You can for a local option levy, that sort of thing, but not for a bond issue.
Yes, sir.
I had a question for the full faith and credit borrowing. Do you have a sense of what the typical interest rates range would be? I know it probably depends on a lot of things, but is there a range in 2011 that we would look for?
Well, that's a good question. We talked a little bit about differentials, but we haven't really talked much about aggregate rates. Right now, historically, interest rates are near their all-time low. And if you had all followed the Standard & Poor's downgrade of the U.S. government long-term debt as of Friday, you would expect that, the lower the rating, the interest rates would go up, right? That's the theory, right? Well, what happened in the market yesterday? U.S. government treasuries had one of their biggest single-day rallies. That means yields, interest rates go down that they've had in 10 years. And the reason for that is because there's way more going on than the U.S. credit rating. It's concern over the equity markets in Europe, Greece, Italy, the United States economy, causing money to come out of stocks and flow into bonds. And guess what? Even though Standard & Poor's thinks that the U.S. is a little less creditworthy than they were Thursday afternoon, the rest of the world still thinks, well, relative to what else, this is still a good place to put the money. So money goes into treasuries and interest rates plummet. So why is that as background? Well, interest rates right now are at or near their historical lows. To give you an example, our firm today sold a small revenue bond issue for Rockwood Water People's Utility District. It's out between Portland and Gresham, if you're familiar with the area. It is an A1 rated credit, which is kind of in the mid to lowerish range of classic municipal ratings. Not a gilt-edged credit per se, but a fine credit. It was a 20-year transaction, $6.5 million. Their all-in interest rate was 3.89%.
Wow, I want that.
3.89%. Now, if that had been a general obligation bond, it would have been rated higher, probably would have been a AA2 type rating, higher, not quite up to the federal government's, but getting closer. And they probably would have lowered their interest cost by maybe 20 or 30 basis points, so 0.2 or 3%. If it had been a full faith and credit of the district, I think it probably would have had a fairly similar rating, and so would have probably priced about the same. Now, these are historical low interest rates, so, you know, a year, 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, who knows what you would be. But to give you a range, you know, if the general obligation bonds will probably, for a city like Oregon City, would probably price, you know, 20 or 30 basis points through a full faith and credit type level, but probably not more than that. Then a revenue bond is completely, I mean, for the city right now with the charter the way it is, a revenue bond is just not feasible. Investors won't buy something where the city has its current set of constraints on raising water system revenues. It's just not possible to sell that sort of structure. If you had a classic revenue bond structure, you'd probably see rates similar to a full faith and credit or maybe slightly higher than that. But that really gets into the weeds of depends on the particular strength of the credit,
I understand
the amount of
that.
coverage you have, and system reserves, that sort of thing. But, I mean, if you had to borrow, now's a heck of a great time. This is really not a good time to be investing it. But
I guess my question would probably be for the library. Can you explain funding? If we were to go out for a bond to build a library, do you have like a ballpark figures to what that would cost and what the money from the county would, how that all works out?
Well, these are just tentative figures that we haven't
Yeah.
really run by the guys that make the final analysis, but we get about $1.8 million a year from the library district, and we get about $200,000 a year directly from the city that goes right into a capital reserve fund. So according to my current expenditures and my future estimates on staffing and the concept of having a real lean, mean fighting machine and lots of self-service checkouts and that kind of thing and keeping staff costs low, which is, of course, where all the costs
Yes.
are, I'm thinking that I could put about $500,000 a year, 1/4 of my income, towards debt service. And I realize that in doing so, I would be tying up, future income for a long time. So it's a very serious conversation to be had, obviously. But I think that would cover debt service for, I'm hoping, $6 to $7 million. And, we already have 1.1 saved. We have 1 million coming to us, and then we'd still need to come up with some difference because we expect a building to cost approximately $10 million. But I mean, that could change too. depending on lots of things.
Right,
So
right.
that, that's pretty much getting us there.
Uh-huh.
If indeed that amount of money would cover the amount of debt that I think we need to take on. So we'd have to obviously sit down and really carefully analyze those figures, but.
Right.
I just want to clarify what you said. The 1.8 million is the total district revenue coming in. So only part of that is put in the capital reserve fund.
1.8 is the total revenue district coming in. The 200,000 from the city is what's going into the capital reserve
Okay.
fund. The money from the district is unrestricted as to how it is expended. So it can
Yes.
go towards operations, capital projects, whatever.
I see.
Yeah.
Is it possible, excuse me, do we know what Oregon City's bond ratings or credit rating is?
Yes, and just before I do that, I just wanted to comment on to give you an order of magnitude. The Rockwood Water transaction was for approximately $6.5 million, 20 years. The annual debt service was less than $450,000.
Oh, great. That's
So
great
that
to
puts
hear.
it definitely in the workable
Great.
ballpark based on these numbers.
Thank you, Dave. You
That's
just
good.
made my night. I know.
You don't have a credit rating. You theoretically can have multiple credit ratings. Actually, I believe that the city only has a single rating outstanding. And David, I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but I just need to find my notes. And I think it's A. And it's from Standard & Poor's. And it's actually on the GO bonds. So every credit has its different rating. So the city, if it had outstanding revenue debt, it would have a rating on that. If it had general obligation debt, it'd have a separate rating on that. And if it had full faith and credit, it would have a separate rating on that. Typically, the rating hierarchy, again, is, as you might expect, general obligation credits tend to be the strongest, get the highest rating. Full faith and credit ratings are either right as the same as GO ratings, which is how Standard & Poor's rates bonds. Moody's Investor Service, the other large rating agency, tends to rate full faith and credit ratings one notch slightly lower than a general obligation bond rating. And then a revenue bond rating, totally dependent on the source of revenues. They can be quite strong. As I said, in some cases, you can have a revenue bond rating that's stronger than your GO rating. I mean, actually, State of Oregon has a situation where the Oregon Department, ODOT's revenue bonds are rated higher than the state's general obligation credit based on the strength of gas tax revenues and license fees. So that's kind of the hierarchy. I would say right now that the city's GO rating is probably what we call a little stale, meaning that the rating agencies really haven't looked closely at the city because you haven't asked for a rating for a long time. I couldn't predict where you'd fall, but you'd fall certainly within the A category, and depending on the strength of the credit, you might tiptoe into the AA category. So you'd be catching up to the feds.
Yay. Very good information. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I want to. This is going to be a little bit of a digression, but since we're here, I wanted to ask you. And I want to ask Nancy about this too, relating to systems development charges. I assume that when we go out to finance these projects, financing that as a cost, our system development charges, is part of the bundle of costs that would be funded through this type of financing.
I'm not exactly prepared to answer that with full certainty because I haven't reviewed the system development statute for a while, but we have not included facilities in our system development charge methodologies. We've only included infrastructure. So that would be one concern where I don't think I'd have to amend the SDC rates to encompass the costs of the facilities. And is the SDC statute one that you cannot fund facilities, or you cannot fund staff, I think, for sure? I know for sure it's staff, but
There's, you have some flexibility, but I believe the statutes describe two different kinds of systems development charges that are what are called reimbursement charges, and then there are things called, I think, improvement charges.
Right.
And improvement charges are sort of dedicated to particular kinds of improvements that need to be made in the future. You know, an SDC is imposed when you ask for a building permit, so they're a charge that occurs in connection with development. So the improvement SDCs are designed to raise money to pay for facilities that will serve that development. The reimbursement SDCs are designed to get back from new development money that was fronted by the citizens who were there when they paid for the costs of the system. And so reimbursement SDCs, that's just money. You can use it any way you like. The improvement SDCs are more limited, and you need to analyze them carefully to see if you can use them. Is that responsive to your question?
Yeah, and just as a follow-up, I'm kind of intrigued by the statement that we don't have facilities SDCs. Okay, so, but if we, for example, built a library, if we had to extend the sewer to that library, there would still be an SDC imposed for the extension of that sewer. So,
on the library.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
that
And I'd
the
have to fund that.
In fact, the library, yes, they
So
would pay
that's-
SDCs.
Okay, that's my, so the extension, though, of that sewer, is what you're saying is the extension of that sewer that will impose an SDC on the project overall, would or would not be payable through part of that bond issuance?
You can borrow, I misunderstood your question. You
Okay.
can borrow to pay the SDC. There are some minor tax issues you need to work through. The Internal Revenue Service allows you to borrow for this kind of a facility with what are called tax-exempt bonds that bear especially low interest rate. But to get that low interest rate, you buy into a whole bunch of regulations. One of those regulations is you have to monitor your bond proceeds until they're spent. So just, and it's never spent if the right hand pays the left. You need to pay some outside party. So just borrowing money on a tax-exempt basis to pay an SDC on a city project and just having the money sit there after it was paid would be something you'd want to work through. But you can deal with it.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Nick.
And I'd be happy to just kind of poke into that a little bit more.
Because I think we're going to face it on both projects, huh?
Definitely.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, either of staff or Mr.? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks very much.
We'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break before we come up to our next item, Willamette Falls Media Center. Thank you for coming in for your vacation. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. Well, most of the commissioners, I think the three particularly that I'm looking at here, were all present for our work session, our joint work session with West Lynn a few days ago. And at the conclusion of that, there was a consensus both among West Lynn officials and Oregon City officials that what we would do is each have a separate work session individually and try to come up with a consensus as a city. And then the Mayor Neely and I would then meet with the mayor and city manager from West Lynn and see what we could work out. I think that was really a good move because you got a lot of information on your plates that night, and you've had a week or so to sort of process some of that and think it through and think about the options. I'd like to say a couple things in general in reaction to the presentations from both MAC and from Willamette Falls. The city has been very supportive of the Chamber's Buy Local campaign. And, in theory, a much larger organization like MAC, if everything is run equally and with the same degree of oversight and thought and prudence, the larger organization, because of economies of scale, should be able to compete more favorably on price. But also, when you think about buy local, sometimes, I mean, my theory is that if you're really close on price, you always try to buy local. And with Willamette Falls, there are some local access issues that are very clear and I think have some worth. How you assign relative to value to that is, of course, an individual decision. But also, the other day we were talking about an issue here. Somebody made a suggestion, I believe Mr. Mabey made a suggestion to us about something we could put on our website. And an example of the kind of service we get on the local level is during the meeting I had a fax from someone at Willamette Falls saying we would be happy to help with that. So, you know, all things being equal, you want to buy local, but I guess what I'm trying to tell you is I don't really think things are equal. One is a little more focused on price, the other one is a little more, there's a tradition there. And then the real difficult wrinkle here for you, and I've wrestled with this in my own mind, even though I don't have the burden of voting on this, is the relationship with West Lynn, because I really have no idea, and I don't think any of us do at this point, which way they're likely to go. I do think there was a lot of information shared at that last work session that may impact their decision. Hopefully, Mayor Neely and I will have a chance to meet with West Lynn more than once if needed, so that we can try to forge a consensus between the two cities and work together on this. So I think what we'd like, Mayor, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what we need from our commission is some direction on which, maybe your priorities of the options you have here in your staff report, as well as maybe other options that you've thought of that aren't in the staff report. If you have options, maybe we could rank those according to which ones you find most favorable, and then we could share that information with West Lynn when the mayor and I meet with them.
Well, I think it is a shame that Commissioner Smith is not able to be here, but Commissioner Nocita, I think we could bring him up to speed, and if you have any questions about the joint work session that you missed.
Anything you want to provide me as far as information, I would appreciate. I will also note that I attended a meeting of the Chamber's Government and Economic Affairs Committee last month and received a presentation from Willamette Falls folks, and I think got a pretty good sense of what some of the options were at that meeting.
Okay. So I guess the part that you probably missed was all the presentation from MAC.
Correct.
So what they were saying is they have a group of people that, let's see, what's it called, Mayor Neely? Is it it's like I don't want to say division, but anyways, a group of different cities that they, mostly in Washington County, so they can go to Comcast and try and get a better price and a quicker price for the franchise fees. Is that correct? Okay. The issue is they're building a new building, and it's going to be on the west side of Beaverton. And so our people in Oregon City and West Lynn they would have to drive to Beaverton to use the services, unless we could figure out a way to rent stuff and hold classes and that kind of thing. The other issue is MAC is definitely a business, and when you get into a business atmosphere, and maybe Commissioner Roth can relate, you kind of become more of a number when you're in a larger organization. You lose that community feel of being smaller and local.
I wanted to correct one thing. Is they didn't discuss renting equipment. They discussed checking it out, like a library system.
Okay, yeah. Yes, thank you. So was there anything else that was kind of it.
Well, they were, I think, in a position on being unable to answer certain questions because no agreements have been worked out in terms of the overall community services they could provide, as well as other things. One thing that concerned me was that it was after the meeting that the representative from MAC said that they were under a major time constraint because in terms of redoing their franchise, they had to specify the other entities they'd be serving. They had to have that agreement in a matter of a very few months, and I don't know, it wasn't on the recording. Of course, I don't know if any Mac's presentation was on the recording since the microphone didn't seem to be working for them. But do you know what that was?
Yes, I checked with them today, and that MAC said that if we're interested in joining MAC to take advantage of their Comcast pricing and negotiation help, that we would need to express that by resolution by November. Because they will be discussing all of the resolutions that have been submitted during the month of November.
Okay.
Which isn't a great deal of time, actually.
I'd like to ask a question just about speech and free speech and political speech. If this were to be placed in MAC's hands, how would programming be controlled and or perhaps censored or regulated, and how would content be determined or restricted as opposed to going the nonprofit route, for example?
I don't think they talked about that,
I don't
did they?
think they did.
Do you remember that?
MAC
That
has a-
wasn't even brought up.
Yeah, they have a governing board that's made up of, I believe it's elected officials from all of their member cities. And I'm pretty sure they have a policy on that,
They have lots of policies.
but I don't know what it is offhand.
I don't know how it is on Willamette Falls right now either. So, do you know the answer to that, Commissioner Nocita?
I don't know the answer to that.
Well,
That's why I'm asking.
we have people here that can
We have,
probably address that
yeah.
question, so perhaps we can ask whichever representative wants to come forward, be it the president of the board, the manager, or both. And you get to introduce yourself, and you know all that.
Certainly do. Is this mic on?
Should be.
Okay. My name is Dan Holliday. I am the current chair of the Clackamas Cable Access Board, which oversees Willamette Falls Media Center. I'll let Melody explain our broadcast policy, but one of the things that I think you need to take into consideration in your discussions about this is you really need to contact the folks, not MAC, but the users of MAC on the public side. Because I have been in contact with those folks over the last few months, and they are extremely unhappy with MAC. And I'm talking about the independent volunteer producers, the folks and the organizations that use TVC, which is Tualatin Valley Community Television. They talked, and the guy from MAC talked about they're building this brand new state-of-the-art studio. What they didn't say is that that's only for government use. That only a very tiny bit of that is going to be, I guess, less than 600 square feet is going to be available for the public to use as a studio. So the big, fancy new studio that's got all the bells and whistles is only going to be available for government organizations, not for the public. So I think that's a key thing, and I think you really need to talk to the organizations that are out there in the MAC service area to find out just how friendly they are to to private, I should say, to the actual public as far as using the station, the free speech access to, building shows, whether it's, the Washington County Democrats, the Washington County Republicans, or, Sustainability Today, or whatever it is. I think you might find that those people are substantially less happy with MAC than maybe their government compatriots are. Melody, do you want to answer the question about how we program?
Yes, we have a set of operating rules, and what the operating rules are as far as program playback is that we do not censor, approve, or disapprove of anything. We do have basically a decency policy The bottom line is if you can't come into City Hall and do it, you can't really come into the facility and do it. However, we do have a little bit of leeway with language. We have what's called safe harbor between 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. That a little bit of language can get in there, but for the most part. But as far as free speech or content, when people fill out an approval slip, it's mainly that is there basically audio you can hear and is there basically video you can see, and then we play it.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how to inquire of users. I mean, I'm sure you can provide me some names, but we, at that study session, there was no opportunity for any public comment, and I had no objections to that. But when it comes to a joint session, and I'll ask our city manager, we've been open in terms of our work sessions, study sessions, in terms of inviting any kind of public comment. I'm not sure that's a requirement.
It's not.
I think we should try to see to what degree we can get public comment at a joint study session. Westland may be more restrictive in that sense.
Yeah, I understand that you're talking about this particular issue. Any
This
future
particular
work sessions
issue
on
when
this
we all both come together.
Well, my understanding was they were going to talk among themselves
Yes.
as a city council and try to determine which of these would be their priorities. And then we were going to talk to our commissioners as a group and then
Right.
try to work with their mayor and city manager to come up with a consensus. I don't know if we may come up with totally different priorities than theirs. And if we do, I would assume we're going to bring that back to this group in a work session and share that with you. We may happen to agree on what those priorities are. That's optimistic, I think. But.
I'm just. It was kind of interesting because I think our dialogues had prior to them had been the city manager, the mayor, the city manager, mayors, and a representative of each council there. And I went in with kind of a feeling that there was maybe a council-wide support for MAC, but certain of the questions, particularly in terms of community services, coming from at least two of the counselors that were there. I think they had 4 of their 5. 2 of the counselors that were there actually were concerned about, of course, community services and providing and how that could be done. And their questions were directed that way. I guess I'll just ask straightforward if this body wishes to push for Willamette Falls. Does anybody want to look at MAC at this point, or have any reason to look at as an alternative?
Go ahead.
I personally don't want to look at MAC because, going from a small entity and going to a larger one, you lose a lot of your community. And MAC says that you have to purchase government channels and then you get so many community events. Whereas right now we get, I think most all of our community events are covered for free, is my understanding, with the franchise fees that we give. So I think it's more, and the equipment's here, the building's here, so I don't know, all the investment that the cities have put into it, I just think it would be a shame to throw it all away. I know that it needs to be worked on, the process needs to be worked on, and I'm more than willing to, be a part of that and help with whatever I need to in that. So personally, I'm not really excited about MAP.
I think what city manager mentioned about economies of scales is significant. But I'm also very concerned about the freedom of speech issues and the freedom of programming issues. And I'm wondering if there's a way to have the best of both scenarios. I don't know if there's a way to benefit from MAC as far as having some sort of affiliation to benefit from its economies of scale, while still maintaining within perhaps a nonprofit of Willamette Falls TV.
I can answer that question. I have discussed, because Milwaukee is currently in that scenario. They have an IGA, an intergovernmental agreement, that only covers their franchise fee negotiations and the ongoing maintenance of the contract with Comcast as far as complaints and that sort of thing. But that's a standalone entity from MAC, and they only allowed Milwaukee to do that to allow their contract to catch up. And then at that point, then Milwaukee has to make the decision either to go full time with MAC or to back out of MAC. So they won't allow anyone else to have that arrangement. So you either join full bore, everything, it's a take it or leave it proposition. And that's what the gentleman from MAC told me after the meeting.
And
did that question come up during the meeting?
No, I don't think it did.
No, I don't think it did. Called out.
The other thing, when pressed on the question of how do you provide the services here in Oregon City in terms of people who want to check out equipment and so forth, they had no ready answer to that whatsoever. It appeared that people would be going to the West Beaverton area to do that, which is not convenient for us, or our users, I should say.
Well, I should also mention, if I can, we have a large number of groups. The Clackamas County Democrats do a live to tape show. Is it once a month? Our church groups. There's a lot of different folks that come in and do and use the actual studio to produce programming. And I guarantee you that if they have to go to Beaverton to do that, it's just going to stop.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I might add that what Mr. Holliday said about the all or nothing membership is consistent with what I've heard as well. That you either join completely or you don't join.
Okay, so is there a way to quantify what the cost differential would be for either Willamette Falls TV continuing under the guise of West Linn and Oregon City, like the current board, or Willamette Falls TV as a nonprofit? What's the cost differential between that type of independence and going with MAC?
Well, Willamette Falls is evolving. I mean, it has evolved a lot in the last 3 months. It's, I think, going to evolve even further. At the work session with West Linn, I believe it was Mr. Holliday that announced that they're thinking more seriously about trying to achieve some nonprofit status. And so with that evolution, again, we get back to this theory. If we're getting a similar level of service, we should be pretty close on price. And even when I look through the different menus, and of course the menus are not apples and apples, which really makes it difficult to quantify. But I think, all things being equal, we should be very close on price. Another thing that's affecting them is the city's both budgeted less, and they're right now, and I think even before we did those budget changes, they were undertaking some internal analysis to see how they could operate more efficiently. So I think they were going to do that anyway, and the budget cuts made that more compelling. When you look at these options that are in front of you, A through D, and again, there may be others that we didn't list in the staff report. If anyone has those, let's talk about them. You might be thinking about option B as the one that would most accommodate Willamette Falls' ability to pursue nonprofit status and give them some time to do that. Mayor, I think the wording that you had, or the caution that you had from MAC about the November membership, I think that's also consistent with what I've heard. That doesn't mean you can't ever join MAC. It just means you're not going to benefit from the franchise negotiation unless you do it by November. I think that you and I, in meeting with them after this work session, I believe that we can get some answers before November. I should hope so. I can't see as much dialogue as we've had in our communities, both communities, about this subject in the last year. I can't see why it should take that much longer.
Right.
Once you know what your priorities are,
Right.
which of these options are most attractive and least attractive. Because it's not just whether you want to go with Mac or Willamette Falls, it's whether you want to go with Mac or Willamette Falls, and then there's that unknown variable of West Lynn and how important it is to try to keep them in teamwork with us and Willamette Falls, or if they're going to go a different direction, then I think that we can still exercise some of these options. It's just
Right.
going to be different.
It's going to be different.
Yeah.
I would just say that D was not quite what I said. Mayor Neely's suggestions for the city managers of West Lynn and Oregon City to run the day-to-day operations.
I don't think that's quite what you said either.
No, I was there. I don't remember that.
No.
Do you remember that,
You
Commissioner?
actually
No.
talked about a committee and executive.
Yeah, an executive session in which the city managers and the mayor make appointments, and then that the chair of the current board also be a member of the executive committee. For one thing, we just don't see. I don't think we've ever seen. In fact, when Commissioner when they had their ordinance before us, I think Commissioner Smith reacted in a very predictable fashion by indicating our city managers, what do they know about the day-to-day operations of a TV station? And,
That's right.
And I think it was square. I was suggesting we might have the city manager's appointment may be somebody specific dealing with budget and somebody dealing specific
HR.
with personnel issues, but wasn't intended to manage the day-to-day operations. So
Right.
D would need to be fixed a little bit. But go ahead.
I guess based on what the city manager Fraser has just said, if not necessarily having the complete comparable of economies of scale, but if Willamette Falls as a nonprofit could attain the economics of being comparable to something like MAC, my personal strong preference would be to go that route because I think, especially as far as free speech issues and programming freedom, I think that would be a much preferable way to go than being part of an organization made up of board representatives from municipalities that might somehow, have the propensity not to be so supportive of, speech that criticizes city governments, for example, and to maintain that independence. I'd much rather go that route. So.
I have a couple concerns. Number one is I think that we do need to look at the fiscal things that were presented to us there to be responsible. So that being said, I really don't like the Beaverton location. I think that that's not good. But when I looked at the numbers here of the actual people that are using the facility as, what is it? It wasn't a great number. The second thing that concerns me is I felt a little bit differently about the West Lynn Council. I felt they were pretty strong in their feelings about which way they were going to go. And
Can you share that with me? Which way you think they're going?
I think they're going to go to MAC. And when I
That's-
did ask the question, what would happen to the agreement if West Lynn went that way, where would that leave us? And Dan answered, you said, well, tell me what you said again.
I'm sorry, I was using both ears here.
If I might, before Dan chimes in there, you may recall that I said something about trying to have some time in which to make a transition, because if, for example, one party in this arrangement pulls out, we are going to have major change. And what I want to do is make sure that if that's going to occur, that we do it responsibly. And if that means, for example, that Westland would say, well, we're going to run as fast as possible by November toward MAC, I still believe that if trying to salvage what we have with Willamette Falls is your priority, I still believe that it's like any other dissolution of a partnership, a marriage, any other kind of corporate structure, where people are saying, what's the responsible way to do this? We can do this and, have the kids go to the orphanage, or we can do this and be responsible and try to make it work in their best interest. And to me, that's what we should push for, if indeed that's where they're going to go. Because I believe that at the end of the process, and I've talked to some folks from Willamette Falls about this, and I think it's an ideal scenario, and it might even really put them in a competitive position when they're dealing with MAC, because as MAC, if they continue to make inroads into Clackamas County, they're going to be long-term competitors, much bigger competitor, better funded and all that. So Willamette Falls would need to try to figure out in the marketplace, and I think they've already started this process, how do we compete? And one of the things they said to me early on, well, in the last 4 or 5 months anyway, that I liked, was this idea of having sort of an a la carte menu of things. You get a basic membership that gives you basic services. And then you're able to, because for managers and budgeting, it's so difficult for us to quantify what we get for the money sometimes from these various providers. And that would be, then we would end up, we've got a nonprofit, so Commissioner Nacita's concern about, well, how much is government meddling in what's said over the airwaves? As far as I'm concerned, the less of that I have to be involved in, or you, the better off we all are. So then in an ideal scenario, they're a complete functioning nonprofit that's thriving. There's competition, which is good, I think, even for that service. And the city managers around the metro can get a menu and say, I'd like this, or I don't like this, I need this, or I don't need that. And this is exactly what it's going to cost, and they can budget for it every single year. They're sure there's going to be inflationary pressures and increases in those costs like there are for everything else. But to me, I would be so pleased at the end of all this process to see something like that and see it viable and healthy and have those options for a subscription, so that I could simply renew every year and count on the service. And Westland maybe thinks that because MAC has maybe a more advanced structural system there, that they think they can get that quicker than by waiting. And if in fact that's where we want to proceed as a group, then certainly Doug and I can try to make our best case in trying to do that responsibly with Westland. And maybe there's some minds changed that night, Kathy. I don't know.
Right.
I think you were right going in, and maybe nothing changed afterwards.
The other thing I'm concerned about is, like, we budgeted 50%?
16% of our PEG money, which is about half.
50% less.
50% less.
Yes. And so did they.
And so did they. So where does that leave Willamette Falls for the year?
Short.
Well, they're here. I mean, they can function. I believe they have quite a few cash reserves. They can function. But if we look at the bigger concern is what happens if Westland pulls out next year and the year after that. And that's why this transition period and working out some kind of transition plan is really critical.
Right.
Yeah.
So can I answer a couple of those questions now? So I want to address users to start with, because we have to understand that just like any television station, that the number of people that work there does not directly translate into the product. So, and the product is actually the television that we produce, whether it's the volunteer producers or our government, partners that we have folks that are out there recording government channel or government meetings like this one and then putting it on the air. So we're over 6,000 hours of programming a year that we produce.
776 participants.
Yeah, and so we have, I think the information about users, while the number of producers is maybe not a huge number, there are also the ancillary volunteers and the other folks that participate in actually making those programs come to life. But the more important thing is the actual number of hours of programming that we're providing is fairly substantial for the actual dollar costs that we're talking about that we run the studio on.
So maybe you can help me understand this a little bit better, this chart, because I'm looking at...
Which chart are you looking at?
I'm looking at user metrics, 2008 through 2011.
That might be Janelle. And I just want to interject, as far as like MAC, they have 14 cities in their jurisdiction, and they have 60 producers for 14 cities. So we have 6 cities, and so if you do the ratio, we actually, comparably, it's kind of producers go through and they get schooled in all of the facets. And not everybody that's on crew and participates completes all the schooling, but they still can participate. So the number is representation of somebody that's completed all the schooling for that year, which can be extensive.
Oh,
so
okay.
They'll be like a leader, and then they'll bring in, like, for instance, a group I worked with West Lynn that just recently produced 13 programs. I actually had 5 people come through the classes, but they had anywhere from 14 to 20 participate with them that took just kind of participation on crew and didn't go through all the classes, so it didn't become a full-fledged, what we would call a number.
Mm-hmm.
So they wouldn't be able to check out equipment on their own, but they can participate in other people's programs.
Okay. But where I see here, number of active producers by geographic area, so it's saying Oregon City for this year so far has 22. And Oregon City, total number of producers by geographic area. So what's the difference between active producers and number of producers?
Well, a producer is someone who has gone through the classes and is able to produce a show. Active producers are folks that during this time cycle have actually produced a show.
Okay. Okay.
Like on our books, we have, I think, like, what, 1,500 people that have, something like that. Anyways, well over 1,000 people that have taken the classes and actually are producers that can come in and solely produce on their own and check out equipment.
Okay.
But they're not necessarily active. It's like people will come in and they'll produce for a year, get burnt out, things happen, they'll go away. So they'll kind of go off our books for a year or two, and then they'll come and cycle back in.
Okay, and actually your numbers look like you're going to break records here for this year on both
Well,
categories.
and I'm convinced that we are, and one of the reasons is the investment that we've made in the building and the facility. The biggest thing for Willamette Falls Television was getting off of Main Street. For the same reason that we hear all kinds of folks on Main Street scream and yell, and that's parking. And for creative people, I don't know if you've ever sat down in front of the computer playing a video game and looked up and it's 4 or 5 hours later. Well, it's the same thing that happens with producers especially when they're editing. You start getting into it and you're doing all this stuff and you look around and all of a sudden, there's 4 hours have been gone. Well, when we were downtown, those 4 hours went by, and then you'd walk out and you'd have a $20 parking ticket. So now we have this, a huge parking lot that most of the time is not full of cars. So it's convenient for folks to come when they wish and spend as much time as they wish, as long as it's during our operating hours. And that has really encouraged a lot of folks, especially the folks that are producing multi-personnel type shows where you've got maybe 4, 5, 6, 8 people it takes to actually make a show happen. When you have 3 camera operators and you have a floor producer and you have the actual studio producer and you have a sound person, it takes a lot of people and a lot of car spaces and all that sort of thing. So when we have that kind of space available, it's starting to pay off.
Thank you.
And I just might mention, we haven't even started running at really full capacity yet. We haven't really had a full, solid year where we can concentrate on production. And we're really hoping in this next year that we're able to move some staffing around in such a way that we can really get busy on what we do.
And I want to answer the elephant in the room, so to speak, has always been the finance piece. And we have changed our budget around and actually have a person in mind who has, she's a CPA, right? So she's a CPA, kind of a strange, at least I believe that's what I did the initials correctly, but is also a licensed clinical social worker.
Might be a good.
But has the finance experience and is willing to work for Willamette Falls on a part-time basis to be able to do those financial management and HR duties. So that's a subject that will be discussed at the board tomorrow night. But I think that putting that person in place really resolves most of the, quote, financial concerns that might arise from this. And then just having the opportunity, the time to move forward, I believe that we can move this into a nonprofit status that would allow us to, and there are other customers in the area, Canby for one, that we have had some initial discussions with that have had some funding reductions on their own, but would still want to have access to the community television stuff. So I believe that we could negotiate long-term contracts with our partner cities and add some other partner cities. If you look at the numbers that MAC provided, they're asking for a total of 28% of your franchise fees, and the great majority of that is for contract administration. I think if you talk to folks now, that may have been necessary back in the days of TCI and Frontier, but Comcast has turned out to be a pretty excellent community partner and is doing a good job with customer service. If you look at the FCC reports, Comcast has substantially fewer customer complaints than they had on other, as they've purchased cable systems and revamped them, and so I think that you'd be spending a lot of money with MAC for not a whole bunch when you consider they negotiate the contract every 10 years. So, that's just something you might want to think about.
How long do you think this evolution process will take?
Well, when I had my initial meeting with Mr. Fraser, Mr. Jordan in January or February, I had anticipated having fiscal 2011 to do that. And I thought that I could make that happen within fiscal 2011. However, we've used a good portion of this year dealing with all this instead of being able to concentrate on making that happen.
Only 30 days into fiscal 2011.
Right. Well, I understand that, but when we were talking,
you didn't get a running start.
Yeah, I would have spent the last 3 or 4 months, building relationships and working with the county commissioners and other folks to start to make this happen, and I haven't had the opportunity to do that because all I've been doing is run around with a fire hose.
So what would be your estimate now?
Well, I would hope that we could that there's still a possibility that we could get it done by the end of fiscal 2011, but it may not be able to. I could have a better estimate of that in a month or so.
But we're not talking years.
No, I don't think so. I think it might take years to negotiate, how you break up Oregon City and West Linn, but one of the things that you have to consider is, and I'm not sure that West Linn really has a full grasp of what it is, but by the time it comes to splitting up the studio, there's not much there that really belongs to either Oregon City or West Linn, except for maybe the cash, because of the way that the equipment is depreciated and how it has been replaced over time. Much of the capital equipment has been replaced with PEG money from other jurisdictions, not from Oregon City or West Linn. So even though from a technical standpoint, Oregon City and West Linn, quote, own Willamette Falls TV, they don't necessarily own a lot of the capital equipment that is sitting in the studio.
You presume you got a financial track to indicate that's the case.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Commissioner
Millard, I want to ask you just a question, because this kind of goes to the MAC versus nonprofit question. If you evolve into a nonprofit, is it your intent to be self-sustaining as far as your own fundraising, or would you still be requesting that either West Linn and Oregon City, or just Oregon City, fund this nonprofit?
Well, I think our hope would be that we'd have service contracts with Oregon City and West Lynn.
Service contract.
That's the idea, is just like in, for, say, the city of Damascus.
Right.
We provide a certain amount of service for them. They have a contract with us, and that's what we would anticipate. We would have a service contract with Milwaukee and Oregon City and hopefully Westland.
So to broadcast, for example, these meetings,
Right, right.
the city would pay a contract for that service of broadcasting
Well,
over
like-
cable our commission meetings.
Right, because we're like the hub of basically all the channels come into the facility and then we cablecast out of there. So there would
Sure.
be a channel management type set fee that will need to be worked out. And then, if we were to do whatever city meetings, that would be worked out at X amount of
Okay.
dollars and so forth. So, and I think that can all be written into a contract, much like we do, like Dan had said, with our service areas.
So is it potentially then fiscally in the city's benefit to do that because we would only be supporting Willamette Falls TV to the extent that we use Willamette Falls TV?
Well, from a fiscal standpoint, yes. From a moral standpoint, I'm not sure that that's the case. Because in reality, the franchise fees are being paid by cable users to provide public television. And if you're going to take franchise fees and buy tires for the public works vehicles, that's not really the intent of the franchise fee, of the point of the franchise fee. Now, there are two pieces to the franchise fee. There is the infrastructure piece, and there is the public television piece. And I'm not exactly sure how it gets split up, but
can
I
the franchise fee just be assigned to the not-for-profit, or can that only be collected by the municipality?
can only be collected by the municipality under law.
So we would use that, for example, to pay for a subscription to whomever the provider was.
So it wouldn't come out of the general fund, it would come out of the
Well,
Comcast fees.
it's part of the general fund. The franchise fees are part of the general fund.
That
Am I
would
right,
be-
David?
That would
Can
be
they,
the
can,
case.
can they be structured not to be?
I was going to say, it's two different, right?
We get one check from Comcast. $300,000 a year, and like I said, about
One of
60%
the other
goes to
things
general
that-
fund for general fund, general stuff, and the 40% goes to the cable TV fund, which we pay 80% of that, now 40% to Comcast, and like all the equipment in this room, and the operation of this is all taken care of by that.
So one of the other benefits, of course, if the provider is a nonprofit or not, that one of the benefits for us of having a subscription is that we don't spend. What I would say this past 12 months has kind of been an inordinate amount of time on this particular service area, as far as management time and staff time and all the rest. I think it's been problematic in trying to make the partnership work and with all the parties. And so my hope is that with that is not something that we will continue to do if we structure this the right way.
Right.
And that is also something we have in common with Westland, and they spent a lot of time on it too. And that's one of the factors that I think is affecting their decision.
I do think you need to keep in mind, and I'll just say this the last time, if someone has Dish or someone has DirecTV, they aren't paying franchise fees. So if you're taking franchise fees and you're dumping it into your general fund, basically you're taxing Comcast customers for your general fund that other citizens in Oregon City aren't being taxed. So that's just something to wrap your head around. The point of the franchise fee system back, when it was begun back in, the late 60s, was the idea that in order to maintain the ability for the public to have at least some kind of a piece of being able to make their own stuff and express themselves, that's the reason that this system exists. And if we continue to degrade that to the point where it's really just it's just another revenue stream, then you've lost the intent of the legislation.
Do Dish people have? I don't watch TV.
The only thing I would add to that is Dan said the franchise system, and he may have meant, at least in my mind, that means the PEG system. not the franchise. We have franchise agreements with lots of providers that use our right-of-way. Apple Cloud's not using our right-of-way, but that cable is.
What I was specifically talking about was the public access piece of
Yeah.
the franchise
That's
fees
the
that
PEG.
was done in federal legislation.
Yes.
So do Dish people have access to this public channel?
No.
Okay.
As far as utilizing
watching.
They can walk in the
They-
studio
they
like
can-
any other member of the public,
But
but
they
they
can't
can't turn
see-
on their TV and
They can't see any of the government channels. None of the government channels are available from the satellite providers.
raking for some of us.
Any other questions? I think I got a couple queries or comments from the public here, but any other questions? Mr. Maybe, I see you launching.
Last public.
Damon Mabey, Oregon City resident and public access channel watcher, so I guess that makes me a consumer. First, lots of gummy worms need to be handed out. What's MAC? Is that Multnomah Athletic Club or the Multnomah Arts Center? Or is it the trucking company?
General
Stafford.
pejorative.
Yeah, but
a general
nobody on
pejorative.
TV can read your
A
stuff.
general pejorative of people of Irish descent.
That's actually Mick. That's Mick, not Mac. Mac is the Scottish people.
The Metro Area Communications Commission.
Metro Area Communications. Okay, thank you. And then secondly, I actually want to a little bit challenge what Mr. Holliday said about the franchise system. The franchise system is more started with, hey, they're using public right-of-way, they need to pay a fee. What then happened later on in the 60s is the companies went, wait a minute, why are you collecting a fee for an infrastructure that already exists and it's public? What are you doing with that? And that's when everybody said, well, we're providing public channels and we're keeping the free speech alive and all that stuff that happens when one company owns the newspaper, the radio, and the TV. There's at least one other alternative. So it was actually an outcome of the challenge to the franchise fee that produced the public access. Which gets me to what I wanted to talk about. I don't know anything about MAC. I don't give a rat's patootie about West Lynn. What Willamette Falls provides to Oregon City is accessibility, particularly in their particular location next to Oregon City Service Learning Academy, which is the people who don't like to sit in school and read books. It's the people who like to go out and touch things and do things. They are right across the street, and there is a great partnership available there. There's no way those kids are going to get on a bus and ride all the way over to West Beaverton to sit in a class. And there's no way that the service can be as good if MAC picks up everything and moves it, for a couple of classes. I like the thought that I can go in, to my city, even if it was in West Lynn, it's still a convenience. And with fairly low levels of requirements, be able to check out a camera. I mean, I have to get schooled in it. I can't just go, oh, give me your most expensive camera, and I'm going to go take pictures of guys fishing in the rain. But it's there. And to address some of your producer-user thing, I know several people who've come and been trained by Willamette Falls TV on how to use editing software and all that, and then they purchase the program themselves, and they're editing football games, basketball games, doing all that sort of stuff in their own home, primarily because their home systems were better than Willamette Falls. Used to be. Let me finish that. Used to be. But those same franchise fees and the move that they're able to make, they've done a significant upgrade. And I guess my big question is, if you're collecting the franchise fees, it should be used for media. I understand this access and everything we did is absolutely part of that system. But, if that, I just am really concerned that if you go to a company and you're starting to write a contract, that then people are going to challenge the franchise. I am. Why am I paying more for a service I'm not getting? And then the last element is another level of public involvement. You have a cable access board, which is citizen involvement. Once it becomes MAC, you all get to go to one more meeting a month or
Only one
every
of us.
2 months. Well, one of you gets something more on your plate. Right now, it's just the mayor. Who cares? But it becomes a big, it becomes a big issue. It's those little steps that get people more and more involved in what happens around them. And that board is another level of public involvement. So, thank you.
And now, the green light has been on our city recorder for some time, and you've got the floor.
Okay, if I may, I would like to just give a little information on the responsiveness of Willamette Falls Cable TV to the city. And we've been a recipient for many, many years of their services. And in the last 6 years that I've been here, I just have to make the statement that there has never been one time when I have asked them to do something for us that they were not able to produce that. They came through every single time. Sometimes their response afterwards was a little slower than I wanted it to be, but they always produced. They always came through. So the responsiveness has been great. I believe they are a yes organization. Yes, we can do that. In fact, they want to do more for us than we have staff and time to give to it. But right now, they're wanting to broadcast more of our boards and commissions meetings. We broadcast them on the internet, but they want to do more, and we just haven't gotten to the policy end of it yet. Is that something that we want to do? And we haven't even had time to talk about it. So they want to do more for us than we can do at this point in time. And then I just wanted to remind you, perhaps you didn't know, but I think, Dan, you might have mentioned it the other day, but the City Commission did approve a resolution in 2008 supporting the move of Willamette Falls from Main Street to the Jackson campus, and it just I just wanted to point that out again. And really, that's all I have to say, other than I just have been, as a recipient of their services, I've been completely satisfied.
Thank you.
I think it probably gives the city manager and myself enough direction in terms of having our discussions with the designees of West Lynn.
Would you like to talk about A, B, C, and D?
Okay.
I get the feeling it's B.
Yeah, I think it was too.
And the least attractive is probably any of the other three.
I think that's correct. I think we do need to talk about some kind of until ownership issues are resolved. I mean, at one point they become a nonprofit. We may dissolve the ownership in some kind of a process, but to have some kind of an executive committee still might be beneficial, and I think make the relation maybe a bit more acceptable to West Lynn.
I think you're probably right.
Well, the commission can't make decisions because you're in your work session, but
Right.
I do think the direction is pretty clear, so we'll pursue B and D in a hybrid with, Mayor and I will meet with West Lynn and try to see where they're at, and we'll report back what we find out. I would also say one thing, if in fact there's going to be a dissolution of the corporation, I am not going to presume what was said tonight, that who owns what assets and all that, because certainly there are smooth divorces and there are bitter ones.
Yes. Yeah.
We want a smooth one.
Yeah.
So
Conversation for another day, huh?
yeah, if it comes to that, I think it's really it would be a tremendous benefit to our community and also to Willamette Falls if we could try to avoid litigation and avoid those other components that could come from taking real strong position right off the bat. So we'll see how that goes and report back to the commission.
Are there any more comments from the public? Yes.
One last thing.
Did you introduce yourself last time?
Yes, I did. Damon
Good.
Davies, resident of Oregon City.
You get to do it
consumer
again.
of. Yeah, I am still who I said I was. Real quick, the other thing that's been happening is the Citizen Involvement Council has been discussing and trying to figure out a way to do Know Your Neighborhood programs, and that's not going to be doable if they have to go to Beaverton. But You know, it's always being discussed because it's available to us, and that discussion will just end. So.
Yeah. Well, then we'll proceed to the city manager's report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple things. First, actually, I have Nancy Krushauer wants to report on a couple items. Also, Nancy Ide. But before we get to those two, I'm going to ask Tony Conkle to just give you a little bit of information about our approach to the visioning RFP.
Thanks. Thank you, David. So as David discussed, we at a work session we talked about moving forward with a community visioning process for the Blue Heron Willamette Falls area, and there was some discussion about very broad goals and objective and aspirations to more detailed, and it seemed like the consensus was that it should be somewhere in that range. We didn't want just goals and aspirations, and we didn't want very detailed drawings and zoning on the property at this point. So that's what we're working on, is to try and find that balance of what are we requesting through a request for proposal for the consultant to produce, as well as in the RFP that we're preparing, the community outreach that we want to see. We've been looking at other jurisdictions, what they've done, what they've been successful with. We've gone back and looked at what we've done, what we've been successful with, and what we haven't been so successful with, to try and get the turnout that we want for this, being of not only local and state, but national significance for this site. And so that's what we're working on at this point. We expect to have a scope in mind, but we will not send the scope out. We'll be sending out a request for proposal with the parameters that we want, and we're still pursuing additional funds to help support this project at this time. We do have some money that has been earmarked that the commission did set aside for the Willamette Falls project area, and so we're working on how much money do we have to utilize to do this project, as well as identify who key stakeholders are, and this is going concurrently with the bankruptcy proceedings that are happening pretty quickly, and so we're in constant contact with the bankruptcy attorney. They brought on a brokerage firm to assist with the sale of and liquidation of both sides of the river. So we've just been reaching out to as many stakeholders as we can to try and build that core group to move this project forward.
You can ask if when you finish with your request for proposal, the vision of that, will you bring that back to the commission before you go out with it?
If you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think the gist of this is that our approach has been that we don't want to necessarily pin down the creativity of who the planning experts are that are going to make suggestions to us, and that's why I think Tony's approach to this was to be broad-based. Mm-hmm. And once we refine that, though, I think what we're going to see is a lot of variables and costs, depending on what level of service they think would yield the best product. And at the end of the day, if we're the only one funding it, we may have limited options. On the other hand, the county and some others have mentioned that they may want to contribute to that process as they're part of it. And if that's the case, then we may be able to get a few more bells and whistles in the RFP. So that's the reason we didn't want to kind of stymie the creativity of the firms that would be making those proposals.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, Nancy Krushauer.
Thank you. Back to the water rate rollback issue. Mm-hmm. I thought I'd just give you a quick update on we actually had completed a draft water master plan last spring, and due to so much other work that was going on, it kind of went on the back burner. And it was the final chapter that had to be completed was the finance chapter, and as time's allowed me to focus back again on it. What we've asked our consultant to do is look at 3 scenarios for finance and funding. One would be so that I'm hoping to create some bookends for the commission to use to to decide what might we want to take to the voters if we're going to try to amend the charter. And one of the scenarios is the current rates that we have that were raised back in 1994, the current rates with the 3% increases that were adopted by budget in about 60% of the years. The other scenario is if we roll back to 1994 rates, and so that would be, the first one would be kind of the status quo. The second one would be if we have to roll back to 1994 rates and then add on top of that the 3% rate increases that were adopted by budget. Now there's a subset of that would be, let's pretend that we could add the 3% increase for every single year. It's not going to make that much of a difference. And then the other scenarios that I'm asking our consultant to look at is what do we need so that you can really know what do you need to sustain this pretty old water. We've got some new pipe. We've also got a lot of really old pipe in this town. And to really approach it from a sustainable standpoint where you know you're going to be replacing X miles of pipe every 75 years so that you don't let your system go into disreputable, yeah, right, into a poorly functioning system. I don't think water systems are disreputable. But anyway, so
we don't want them to be.
That's that. And David Wimmer has been working with Walt Meyer on this. Then we have to bring something to the Planning Commission on the Water Master Plan for them to recommend it to the City Commission for adoption. And the Planning Commission won't be coming to conclusions on the financing positions, but the City Commission will have that information then to use when we're approaching the ballot measure. Okay, so then the second thing is we met with Canby Excavating today. They're the consultant or the contractor doing the Main Street Phase 1 project. And there's some important information that we want to make sure we start broadcasting, and that is that the construction is going to be starting downtown next week. They'll be starting, it's actually the 16th, so that's next week. They'll be starting down at 6th Street, where we've got that little island down there. That's kind of out of the way, and that'll be the first thing to be demoed and go. And then they'll be working on some 8th Street pipe work, and all of these things will occur before the Antique Fair.
Oh, good.
After and they've got very stern instructions, no work on Antique Fair Day. But then the day or the Monday after the Antique Fair is when there will be a much larger impact to the downtown, and that's when they'll start working on the 10th and Main Street intersection. That intersection will be open for Main Street travelers, at least for 2 lanes. It'll be flagged during the day, and it'll be open at night. But if you're traveling between 99 and Singer Hill, which will be going up the hill, that will be closed. And that'll be closed for, the schedule right now calls for 6 weeks. As we all know, things happen with these construction projects. So I never make any promises, but that's the schedule right now. And we're looking at actually a higher strength, a faster cure concrete that would have a curing time of 3 days that will enable us to move that along much faster.
Is the quality of the concrete?
Well, we're looking at that. I believe it is.
Okay.
It's commonly used on highways because you've got to get that road open fast. And it's not that much more expensive than regular cure concrete. We'd still have the same standards for the compressive strength. Well, the concrete will be laid in 3 sections, and that allows us to do the work like we proposed. And the other thing that you'll see at the very beginning of that 10th and Main Street construction is they're going to dig out the entire intersection and do pipe work and get through. There's all sorts of layers of stuff under there. And then they'll put back all the gravel, the actual pavement section, the gravel pavement section, and then just put on a thin 2-inch layer of asphalt while they're doing all of the other work. And then they'll go back in and do the concrete work at the end. So that's kind of the picture you'll see down there. We're intending on having this get out to the Chamber, Main Street, the CIC, the Neighborhood Associations, McLaughlin Neighborhood Association, and on our website just as quick as we can now that we have this schedule.
Can I ask a question? There's two left-hand turn lights if you're heading south on 99E, one at, I believe, 12th and one at 14th. And they're very difficult because they're flashing yellow to turn on. Is there any possibility of giving those a longer signal time during this time?
Well, that's part of the detour route is ODOT will be, we also have to work with the bridge traffic control, so it's kind of complicated for ODOT. They'll be looking at the timing of those signals and seeing how we can maximize getting those queues, the left turn queues, emptied at 12th and 14th Street. We'll probably actually set up the detour route for 14th because we have a signal at 14th and Washington, and the county can adjust the signal timing on that for us. Unlike if we use 12th Street, they'll have a stop sign, and it's not a four-way stop, it's a two-way stop at 12th and Washington, and we can see where that we could get some queues that would be difficult to manage.
Okay.
But you'll have the alternative of using 12th Street, and go by the mayor's house if you like.
Nancy,
I request a signal put on when you do that, then on 12th and Washington. Any other questions?
Just one other thing. I'm happy to announce that the city will be collaborating with Operation Homefront for a September 11th event here in Oregon City. It's actually a national event that the Clackamas Community College will be hosting the Oregon site for this event this year to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 events. They're sponsoring a Freedom Walk. It's a 5K run walk, and again, it will be on September 11th up at Clackamas Community College from 9 to noon. And they have asked us to help advertise the event, and they're seeking runners and walkers from the community and anywhere who would like to come out. It's free for registration, but they will accept donations and so forth. So if any of you would like to either run or walk or help us with our booth, we'll be there handing out water to all the participants. You're welcome to come. Benefits are it supports newly returned soldiers and their families, and also the families of those that are deployed. So that's where the monies go to. And that's it, right?
Thank you. No other comments? I was going to make one suggestion for our study session to clarify our use of electronic equipment here, exactly what and what we cannot do. I'd like to put that on the study session. We've had people looking at emails and so forth, and we need to find out what the parameters are. Okay. Excuse me, what the constraints are. Parameters mean something else to a statistician, so constraints.
It's pretty laid out in your rules that you approve.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, sure, we can add that.
Yep. With that, everybody can go wherever they're going to go.